Welcome to episode 114 of the Civil Engineering Podcast, the first podcast dedicated to helping civil engineering professionals succeed in work and life. While this is the 114th episode of the Civil Engineering Podcast, this is only the 5th episode we are broadcasting via video on YouTube, which we plan to do more often, so be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to listen to any of our past 113 episodes, visit civilengineeringpodcast.com. I am your host, Anthony FASANO. I am a licensed professional engineer who practiced as a civil engineer, but eventually decided I wanted to focus more on inspiring engineers rather than doing the engineering myself. So since then, I've written a book called Engineer Your Own Success and have traveled the world helping engineers. And through this podcast, myself and my co-host Chris Knutson try to bring you information that can help you succeed in every episode. I've also had the honor of authoring the American Society of Civil Engineers Careers and Leadership column for the past few years. In this episode, I will sit down with CEO, co-founder, and chief pilot of Harkin Aerial, Scott Harrigan. Scott will be discussing what civil engineering firms need to know about providing drone services or hiring outside firms to do so. Let's jump right into it. Anthony FASANO here from the Engineering Management Institute, and I am excited to welcome Scott Harrigan onto the Civil Engineering Podcast. Scott is the owner and chief pilot at Harkin Aerial, and we're going to talk about drones today. Scott, welcome.
Great, thanks for having me. Okay.
So drones have been around for a while, but they continue to be more and more popular in the AE industry in terms of firms using them for projects for whatever reasons, tough to reach sites, sites that are large, whatever the case may be. And we've had a past episode on it, but it was years ago. And as you and I joked about off camera, tomorrow drones will be different in terms of the technology and things will be obsolete. So I'm excited to have Scott on. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So before we dive into the world of drones, and we have some points we want to cover here, tell us how you got into this space.
Sure. So long story short, it really started in college when I was a mechanical engineering major. And two things happened. One, I was lucky enough to get my private pilot license, or work on my private pilot license in the summers between college. And I originally really was into aviation, and my original career path, I thought I wanted to go more into aerospace engineering.
Right.
But I stuck it out with mechanical, loving aviation all the way through though. And my senior design project in college was actually an RC aircraft, which is where I kind of got into, just designing one from scratch, and really that's how I kind of got into the whole drone RC aircraft craze there. After graduating though, the first job I had picked up out of college was for as an MEP engineer for, a engineering firm on Long Island that did traffic planning, stuff like diesel stations, compressed natural gas stations, that kind of stuff. So I was more towards the civil engineering field, towards the environmental and MEP, and working with architects a lot. So generally, that's kind of how it all blended. The last part of the whole puzzle was that I was actually working weekends with a startup in Brooklyn that was working on drones. So I kind of give my evenings and weekends to these guys in Brooklyn who this is 2013, before drones were really, really taking off. And they had the idea that they would custom build a drone, and they were looking for a mechanical engineer to help them out and help them design a drone there.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's really how it started. Once that idea got in my mind, and I was both doing, the site, the MEP work, and then on weekends was working with drones, that's where I started to think, okay, well, maybe there's a use for these things outside of film and more into, civil engineering, site engineering.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then eventually you started your company, Harkin Aerial, kind of worked on it a little bit on the side, and then eventually was able to do it full time. Right?
Correct. Yep.
Now now you're busy.
Now we're quite busy. Exactly. The key with that was at the time people were really doing film and photography, and it took a lot of time for us to kind of work through the weeds. At one point, it was both a good friend of mine, back at one of my best friends from high school actually, is who I originally started the company with.
Okay.
Also another mechanical engineer, a guy who went to actually UPenn for robotics, so he was very into that whole thing.
Wow.
And from there, we decided that this we really loved RC aircraft, we really loved drones, and we kind of wanted to tailor it more towards the engineering sector. And we thought, well, this is a tool that some people are taking photos of, real estate listings and doing, architecture, photography shoots with
Right.
it. And with my field experience back working with my first job out of college, we realized we could really tailor this more towards the architectural and engineering design aspect of it, and actually, work on collecting data that people would use that would be beneficial to the design process for engineers, and not just photography for marketing and that kind of thing.
Wow, that's great. So that's kind of the evolution of how you got started here.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. Yeah. All right, Scott. So now let's start talking about these things here, these drones. So I understand that there are more than 1 million drones in active use commercially in the U.S. these days. Is that?
That's quite correct. Probably more than that at this point.
Yeah, I'm sure. That's an amazing thing to imagine of how common these things are really becoming. So talk to us a little bit about, well, first of all, let's start with, for listeners or viewers here that are in the AE industry, civil engineering firms, environmental firms, why would they use these things for their projects? What are they going to use a drone for?
Sure. So a variety of things, and how we find it works is firms like to start with the smaller and the easier deliverables first. So the first one is always going to be photo and video. It's always going to be the most readily accessible way to use a drone. Simple aerial photos, video, so, construction progress on a site, just monitoring a site, monitoring for safety, or just generally taking aerial photos to check existing conditions and to, monitor your project as you go through it.
Okay.
That's always going to be the first one, but what people find is once they really get into the drone, they start using it, there's a lot of really amazing technologies that support the drone ecosystem that are very beneficial to engineers. So specifically mapping and photogrammetry are two of them.
Okay.
Mapping is exactly what you'd think, actually creating stitched maps from a variety of photos that the drone takes. These drones can't fly too high. Legally, they are only restricted to about 400 feet, which comes from the FAA.
Okay.
But you can take a lot of photos on a site and stitch them together to create a equivalent of what you'd get from more like satellite aerials.
I see.
So being able to view your entire site at once through some post-processing is really where we see the industry headed, those kind of deliverables. On top of that, what we got into a lot of, and I'd say our number one product we're giving to our engineers, are models made from photogrammetry.
Okay, so explain to us what that is, photogrammetry.
Sure. So photogrammetry is the process of building an accurate 3D model from a bunch of photographs.
Okay.
And essentially, it's complementing surveying operations more and more in the field because you're actually able to create your entire model in 3D. And by using reference points from a surveyor, you can actually create a very accurate 3D model. So you can get rough elevations, you can get contours, you can get a lot of site data that you just could not before from the drone. So we're really seeing it move that way. And products and modern CAD programs are all learning how to accept the 3D modeling data from the drone and integrate it into CAD more and more easily than ever before. So that's kind of like the next generation we're seeing there, where the drones were great at taking photos and video, but now they're delivering real measurable data, and mostly in the form of 3D models that engineers can use to make site measurements way easier.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yep. And so I would imagine that as drones evolve, your services evolve, and what you're able to do for firms evolve. And it sounds like there's a whole nother kind of atmosphere of the software now that goes with these and the programs that can support this.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. When we first started, most of our training was just showing somebody how to fly and operate the drone. Right. And that's getting easier and easier every time. I mean, these have automated flight systems in them that'll basically do the mapping for you. You're more guiding it to the area you want, and it will actually execute a flight by itself. So as the drone itself gets easier and easier to fly and operate, our training and our consulting has gone more towards, well, what do you do after that? How do you get a good, accurate 3D model from these things? Right,
because you've amassed all this data now, and you want to use it as effectively as possible.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So that being said, that gives us a good idea of what we might use the drones for. talk to us about regulations and guidelines for these things, because obviously there are a bunch.
There are quite a few. I think one good thing for engineering firms looking to adopt this technology is it's definitely easier than it used to be.
Okay.
Brief history. Originally, and how I got started in this is you actually needed your private pilot's license to fly a drone for commercial purposes originally, which is pretty crazy. The FAA required that you be at least a private pilot or higher on the manned pilot certification to fly one of these. And in 2016, that all changed. So in August 2016, the FAA issued what's called the Remote Pilot Certificate, which is much, much easier to obtain, and it's how any engineer can legally fly drones commercially. It's basically you go and you sit and you take, I believe it's a 70-question test nowadays, and if you complete and study for that test and you pass it, you have a commercial drone license for 2 years. So actually, yeah, very, very, and getting certified is actually one of the easiest parts of the whole thing. Where it gets more difficult with regulations and where we are now is still working out how to get drones operating near airports and near more congested areas in a efficient and safe manner. So if you live near a major city, you're going to have more regulatory hurdles than if you're, out in a much more rural area. Like, for example, here in the tri-state area, we have 3 airports. Right. We have JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark, so we're in the thick of it. It doesn't get more complicated.
So there's like some kind of a radius, I guess, from the airports?
Yep, and without delving really far into it, it gets a little crazier, and actually the majority of the commercial drone pilot test is learning all about the airspace that manned pilots have to learn about, which isn't always perfect circles. There's some weird shapes, weird designs, and figuring out where it's legal to fly. Generally, as long as you're not in controlled airspace, you won't have an issue, but now more and more there are pretty solid pathways to operate there. You basically have to file and do some paperwork in advance with the FAA if you want to fly near an airport, but you can. There is a process to legally do that.
For doing
and that's a big part of what we help engineering
companies do.
Exactly, work through all that paperwork and all those permits.
So tell me this, so do you work more for engineering companies that have drones and you assist them with either the drone services or the data once they've collected it? Or I'm assuming both, but just talk a little bit about the differences.
Sure.
Or do you work for firms that have no drones at all?
Sure. Still the majority of the work is actually with firms that have no drones at all. Okay. It's generally a size thing. A lot of the larger engineering firms that have, some resources to devote to this will start and bring a drone program in-house.
Okay.
But a lot of the mid and smaller size firms still find that the FAA hurdles are just still not something they want to deal with. And so we do handle a lot of that. I'd say the majority of our clients are still, we're flying, we're processing, we're delivering to them. But I think that needle is going to shift more and more towards even the mid and the smaller size companies adopting their own drone program, because it is getting easier. And the FAA is working out smoother ways, and there are really interesting startups out there that are trying to simplify airspace warning and make simpler maps for people to understand all these regulations.
Okay, so you'll probably be shifting in the future more towards support services because more and more companies will adopt it, which seems to make a lot of sense. So, if our listeners are listening here and they're interested in maybe bringing drones into their company, what are some things that they should be aware of? Of course, the regulations, which you told us about already. Sure. But, anything else about drones or when they're deciding on what drones to purchase and things of that nature that you could offer to the listeners?
Sure, definitely. Like many new projects, starting off simple is a really good way to go. A lot of engineering firms think that, we're taking measurements, we're, doing some, heavy duty stuff here. We need to go crazy and buy, a giant expensive drone. Not at all. I mean, this is the DJI Mavic Pro, a fantastic one to start out with. The drone, all in all, on the older models costs anywhere from like $1,000 to $1,500 for the drone, and a few $100s more for batteries. And this can do a significant amount of inspection and photography in its own right. So starting off with just a small amount of drones and easing into it is really the way to go, I find.
Keep it simple.
Exactly. And the other thing is have a good idea of what you want to accomplish. Before you even go out and get the drone, decide what challenge are you trying to solve with the drone. Because though you can start simple, there's a variety. I mean, there are people who use drones for thermal imaging, there are people who use drones for mapping, and like many things, not one drone can do it all well. You may have to specialize and, you know, pick a more specific drone for what you want to do. So having a very clear understanding of what you want to get will help everything, because it's not just about buying the drone. It's about what kind of data are you producing. Does that data take up a lot of, you know, space on computers, and storing the data and processing it, and figuring out that whole workflow before you even start to do your field operations with drones is going to save people a lot of time and money in, you know, getting the most out of these.
That's interesting. And so what was the model? And again, we have a drone here. If you're listening to the audio version of this, we'll put a link in the show notes to this drone. Otherwise, you can go to YouTube and just Google Scott Harrigan Civil Engineering Podcast, and you can check out the drone. So this was the DJI.
Yeah, this is the DJI Mavic. This is actually now a older model. It's been replaced by the DJI Mavic 2, which has a far better camera, a really, really amazing camera, actually.
And this is the camera here in the front.
Yep, exactly. And if you want to see here, so the way these work is it's gimbaled. So it sits in its own little stabilizing enclosure. So, you know, the photography and the video that comes out of this thing is already insanely stable. So you really don't have to do much work in terms of the photo and, you know, acquisition part of it. And this is considered the lower tier of, you know, the whole world at this point. So you can do a lot with a little with drones, and it really doesn't take much to, you know, get a program running and start collecting meaningful data with them, and you know, really just starting to get some use out of them.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, quite frankly, for civil engineering firms or environmental firms, you're always looking to differentiate yourself, and there's still enough firms, like you said, that don't have any drones yet, you know, based on the work that you're doing. And so even just getting a simple one and starting to do some simple work, even if you have someone like Scott who's also helping you on the back end, you know, again, it's a differentiating service.
Exactly.
That you can say to people. And I know from my work as a civil engineer, when I was working as a surveyor, many jobs we got because we did the surveying first. And because we had the survey, they hired us to do the engineering. I mean, it just made sense. We were on the site. We were familiar with the site. So, you know, if you have a drone and you're able to get a job because you have a drone, again, you get on the inside track to getting the full engineering services for that project.
Exactly. And it's, you know, I tell people it's a lot easier to have those years of experience as a surveyor, a civil engineer, and learn the drone portion than it is to come in blindly knowing drones and learn the surveying and the engineering portion. So civil engineers and surveyors especially are in just a really, really good position to take care of this to take advantage of this technology, because you're still going to need to do groundwork. You still need to go in and do that initial site survey. This can just really extend your, you know, really extend your efficiency in doing those ground surveys.
Yeah, and you're right. So in our field, you can really leverage the technology because you already understand mapping, you already understand what you need in terms of sites. And those of you that are listening, I mean, we talk about this a lot in developing an expertise in your engineering career and what that can do for your credibility and your reputation. This is a perfect thing that you can focus on and become an expert in drones because it's relatively new, and you don't have to go to school for years to learn it, right? You can take courses, you can do things to learn about the technology, and you have that background in engineering that you can use to leverage it on top of it. So that's what I really like about it. So Scott, one other thing here, let's talk about in terms of firms that want to, you know, bring drones in and use these services. What do they need to think about in terms of insurance?
Sure, that's a great question. So generally, insurance with drones is covered separately under its own insurance policy, both covering the drone itself and the liability coverage for it. So you can call up a variety of places, and people can go generally through their existing brokers that already give them insurance, and they'll be able to find and get them a unmanned aircraft insurance policy. Liability is pretty much required on any site you're working on for the drone, and people definitely want to understand that, you know, your general liability usually won't cover something like a drone, because the minute that thing's up in the air, it's its own little entity, it's its own little thing, and, you know, you are operating a separate you know, aircraft. You are operating an aircraft as far as the FAA is concerned. So getting the liability insurance that specifically covers the drones is definitely something that you want to do. Covering the drone with its hull, the actual hull coverage, is actually more of a specific to what you're looking for. Sometimes the drones are honestly so inexpensive that the hull coverage is not always worth it, because you might be replacing a drone with another drone in a relatively short amount of time. So we found the hull coverage can vary depending on what the intended purpose and what drone you have, but the liability is absolutely essential. You'll certainly want that, because they are fast, small objects, and you know, God forbid you have an issue on a site, you want to be covered.
Is there Okay, and that's what you mean in terms of if something breaks?
Right,
or if
exactly.
It's disabled or something. Okay.
Yep.
All right, yeah, that's good to know. So just to recap that a little bit. So first of all, if you want to bring drones into your firm, keep it simple. Don't go crazy. First of all, you want to be able to use it effectively and make it easier to learn. So get a simple model to begin with. Secondly, try to do simple projects. I would say to begin with, you're not going to start with the most complex project on your own. You might want to have someone like Scott help you, but if it's a simple site that you can work with, why not give it a shot? It can give you that credibility and that reputation and that angle of against competitors that don't have the drone services. Make sure you're up to date on all the FAA regulations. You're going through the process that Scott explained to get the proper paperwork that you need to be able to fly. Do you call it a license or?
Yeah, it is a remote pilot license or a certificate.
Okay.
And that's what they consider. Yeah.
Make sure you get your certificate, and then lastly, contact your insurance broker and see what insurance coverages you might need to add to make sure that you're covered should anything happen. Of course, with the drone, or God forbid, with someone operating it or something that happens. So we make sure that your bases are covered. So, Scott, before we jump into our Take Action Today segment, talk a little bit about your career. Could you give an example of a project that you've worked on, just to kind of give our listeners kind of a, realistic example of what something this might be used for?
Sure. One of the more exciting projects we did recently is we worked with an environmental engineering firm to try and use thermal imaging, so aerial thermography. So the drone is flying a thermal camera, and we're actually doing an attempt to figure out if we could pinpoint leaks in a village's water system.
Oh, wow.
Yep, basically looking at the temperature difference between the ground that is dry or ground that has been saturated by water that may be coming up from a water main leak. So there's more and more really cool projects like that, and that involves so many different levels of expertise. I myself had to go and take a course on thermal imaging and get my thermography certification on top of my drone certification for that one. So, you're learning how to operate the drone, you're also learning how to interpret thermal images properly, and then on top of that, you're of course working with engineers who understand the water systems very well. So when you're kind of tiering those multiple levels of expertise, you can really deliver a service that is extremely unique and might be able to solve a problem in a way no one had really considered before.
It sounds like such an interesting industry and technology.
It is.
I'm really excited that you're here sharing the information with us. All right, so once again, we're here with Scott Harrigan from Harkin Aerial. Stick around. We're going to come back in a minute and wrap up with our civil engineering hot seat segment, where I'm going to pepper Scott with a couple of questions about his professional development.
PPI is a proud sponsor of the Engineering Management Institute. Thinking about advancing in your career by taking your FE, PE, or SE exam? Visit ppi2pass.com to find everything you need to start preparing today. I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Civil Engineering Podcast on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel here for more podcast episodes, and for all of our Engineering Manager 80/20 Shorts videos, where we interview successful engineering managers and bring their strategies to you. Now it's time to jump into the Civil Engineering Hot Seat segment.
All right, we're back with Scott Harrigan from Harkin Aerial here on the Civil Engineering Podcast, and now it's time for our Civil Engineering Hot Seat segment. You ready, Scott?
I am.
It is pretty hot in the studio, so this works. All right, first question. Are there any specific rituals that you practice every day? For example, do you have a specific morning ritual or lunchtime routine, something that you do consistently on a daily basis that has contributed to your success?
Sure. I don't have a specific morning ritual, except for, simple as it is, lists. I do lists like crazy.
Okay.
I use a little app called I think Wunderlist, which is like a great little free app that works on your phone on that. Actually, that was introduced to me by the startup I worked with drones before, because there's just so many things in a day to tackle. And yeah, breaking everything down into just simple lists and plans of who I gotta contact, who I gotta reach back out to, what I have to complete.
Keeping a good to-do list for yourself is a big routine.
That's definitely a huge one. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. What is one book that you recommend to engineers regularly, or just a book that you found to be helpful, whether it's drone related or just general, any book really?
Sure. I think, it's a classic, but I when I was actually looking for work originally, right out of college, I was looking at How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Okay.
I don't never considered myself a self-help book. I never read a book like that at all, and I had a couple engineering friends suggest that, and I just love that one because it didn't beat around the bush, and it was just very straightforward about how to interact with people. How to always be people focused, and remember that it's always a people problem at the end of the day. Or dealing with people
always,
and understanding what people really care about, and especially when we run like this high tech startup, so to speak, you can get so lost in the details of the technology and all of that, and it just always kept me grounded, and just remember, you're solving challenges that deal with people at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think that it's so important. In the civil engineering world, everything is big projects, big calculations, big reports, right? But at the end of the day, none of that stuff gets done without people and people interaction.
Right.
And so we've had over 100 episodes of the Civil Engineering Podcast. I want to bet or guarantee that 30% of the people that came on the show said that book.
I would bet.
Believe it or not,
and
with good reason. Mm-hmm. And every time someone says it, it makes sense to me. And it gives us a chance to highlight the importance of your people skills, which is something that we focus a lot on here at the Institute. All right, 2 more questions. First one, think about a manager that you had in your career that you really liked. Okay. You don't have to give names or anything, but the point is what was it that made that manager a good manager for you?
Sure. I really lucked out right out of the gate. The first manager I had right out of college for the MEP firm I was working for really, I think, helped me do 2 things. One was open to letting me learn whatever, letting me take the time to learn what interested me, and really letting me, kind of carve out my own interests in the company, and very much gave me the tools to learn, but also knew when to kind of sit back and let me
like a leash to go
exactly out. It gave me the right amount of leash there. And then the other one, I think, is when it came with when it came with the big projects, was also a good filter, in the sense of helped me focus on just understand what tasks I had to complete, and in some ways, in the very beginning, especially when I was a brand new engineer, insulate me in a way from the more complex workings of it, so I could really understand my part in it, and then kind of pull back the blinds bit by bit and understand the bigger picture. And I just always appreciated the way my original manager was able to balance both letting me learn and give me the freedom to train, but also being clear about my role in the company, and making it clear what I need to do to succeed.
That's great. Yeah. It's good that you had someone like that, especially right out of the gate.
Yeah. And taught me AutoCAD. Taught me everything I know about drafting, which I do.
Which is obviously critical.
I use it every day. More now, almost, than when I was an MEP engineer, which is crazy. But yeah.
All right, so last question for you, Scott. If you were to get into an elevator with a young engineer in the AE industry, in the civil engineering field, and they were looking for some career advice, you only had about 30 seconds to talk to him or her. Based on what you've done so far in your career, what would that advice be?
It's definitely to start with what you really love and enjoy, and then I think work from that back to your current position or where you are right now. Because aviation was always something that was a long thread for me, and I originally thought they were 2 very separate worlds. I thought, how could I possibly put aviation and MEP engineering? I was in buildings all day, far from an airport, right? And I felt it was this for the longest time I felt it was this black and white choice. I had to quit this job and leave and go and to become an airline pilot, and it's the only way I'd ever get aviation back into my life. But there are ways. You never really see the road ahead perfectly. So, you might be amazed how things you're passionate about and your current position can, merge together. And I think it's always looking for opportunities to bring your passion into what you're doing and what your current field is. They can be closer than you might expect.
Yeah, no, that's great because, when you love what you do, obviously it makes everything easier and helps you I think, perform better. But it's what I love about that point is that sometimes people think that what they love to do is not related to what they're actually doing or the education background that they have.
Exactly.
But obviously with technology and all things going on today, there's always ways to bring things together.
Yep, exactly.
Just
always.
have to keep looking. So, all right, Scott Harrigan from Harkin Aerial, thank you so much for coming on the Civil Engineering Podcast. We hope that this was helpful for you. We'll hope that you think about drones and how you can possibly implement them into your career by building your expertise or into your company. And until next time, we hope that you continue to engineer your own success.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Civil Engineering Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more video broadcasts of the podcast, or visit our website at engineeringmanagementinstitute.org for all of our free content for engineers. Until next time, I hope that you continue to engineer your own success.